Welcome, everyone. I'm Michelle Williams, and I'm from the Sociology Department here at WITS, and I've also been a fellow traveler with this series, the Democratic Marxism series. I co-edited the first volume, and then have journeyed with the project along the way. So, welcome. This is now our fourth book, the fourth volume in the Democratic Marxism series. And I think we have some of the best covers there are. They're fantastic. And the first one, on the first volume, started off, it was a torn down poster from the Arab Spring. And so they've kept with that theme that now no longer has that direct relevance. This one and all this, the series is edited by Vishwas Satgar, and this one is specifically on racism after apartheid, challenges for Marxism and anti-racism. So each book tries to deal with various contemporary issues, and there are two more books in the pipeline right now. The fifth volume is on new imperialism, the new imperialism of the US and the BRICS countries explicitly, and that's in the review process right now, and volume 6 has just begun the process, and that's on challenges to democracy, the rise of authoritarianism, and new fascisms. So those should be out. We try to get them out every year. It's a bit of a challenge, but that's the way we try to do it. I'm extremely pleased tonight to be able to introduce the speakers that we have to this book. Before I introduce the speakers, I'm just going to say there's a number of authors in the book that are not here tonight. They couldn't all be here, and also you can't have everyone on the same platform. But I just want to mention them because each of the contributors have made a really interesting contribution to this volume. So I'd like to, there's Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz. She contributed a chapter on indigenous peoples movements. She's a Native American, and so she looks at the indigenous peoples movements in the US and Canada, but also the relevance around the world. Feroz Manshi, who wrote a piece on emancipation, freedom, and taxonomy. Ron Greenstein, so earlier today there was a seminar with Ron, Vish, and Pete Hudson. And Ron looks at Israel and Palestine explicitly. And Peter Hudson looks at South Africa and brings in the unconscious psyche into it. We have Fabian Gorgi, who's from Germany, and he contributed a chapter on racism and European migration. Nivedita Menon on Marxism, feminism, and caste in India. And then we have three authors tonight who are speaking. And these authors, I think we're really special, it's really lucky to have them. I think all of them would consider themselves activists, scholar, activists, and I think, to varying degrees, the activist versus scholar side. But each one, I think, has made a really wonderful contribution. So first, I'll introduce Khwezi Mabasa, who is an activist out of the labor movement. He's a PhD student here at WITS, but he also works for Mistra and has written widely already at a young age on issues that pertain to South Africa. Then we have Sharon Ekambaram, and Sharon is a longtime activist, a human rights activist. She was the first, I think you were the first executive director for Doctors Without Borders in South Africa, part of the TAC original group. She's been a longtime activist, and she currently works for Lawyers for Human Rights. We have Vishwas Satgar, who is also a longtime activist, and he's associate professor of international relations here at WITS, and he's also written widely on many things, including in this series. At the end, they each are going to have 15 minutes to present, and at the end, we're going to have Sean Bolton as our discussant, again, a longtime activist, but he's currently the executive director of the Ahmed Kathrada Foundation. Let me just say, this series and the incredible contributions in all of the series, but especially this one, are made possible not just because we have wonderful contributors and authors who stick to very strict timelines and deliver and get over their own writing blocks and stuff on time, but also because we have some really important institutional support. Two institutions need special mention. One is the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation, the South African office. They've been journeying with us on this series from the very beginning, and they continue to give it unqualified support. And I think this is a special year for the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation. It's a 100-year anniversary of Rosa Luxemburg's assassination. The NIHSS, the National Institute of Humanities and Social Sciences, also provides support. And one of the things from the volume 3 to this volume, this is partly in part of NIHSS support, Both of them are freely downloadable anywhere in the world, and that's enormous victory in the age of intellectual property rights and the commodification of knowledge. So thanks to the NIHSS and the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation. I also would like to thank Wits University Press. We've been extraordinarily lucky that we've had their support from the beginning. They're a wonderful group. I don't know where Veronica is. There's three wonderful women, Veronica, Roshan, and Karina. I think Karina's here, right? So, Karina, are you around?
She just stepped out.
Oh, she just stepped out, okay. I just want to really thank them. And I don't know if it's still true, but they've been an all-woman organization for quite a few years, and I think they're one of the best presses in the country. And they do really amazing stuff, so I want to thank them, and special thanks to them. Okay, that's it. I'm going to give each of you 15 minutes. I'm a bit of a timekeeper, so I will give you a 5-minute warning, and then we'll open up for discussion after the three speakers, and after Sean gives his reflections as well. Thank you. Sorry. Khwezi's going first. I introduced you in the order. Sorry.
Thank you, Chair. So basically, in my chapter, I address two central sort of questions. The first question is, why has post-apartheid democratization failed to adequately deal with racism in South Africa? And this is an important question because the underlying philosophy was that liberal democratization and the development of a constitutional democracy would be sufficient to address racial hierarchies, discrimination, and prejudices. The second point, or the second question that I addressed, or the area that I addressed in my chapter, is a criticism that is leveled against Marxism, right? From both some activists and scholars who argue that Marxism has marginalized race and racism, right? Or the centrality of racism in the development of various societies. And it is an insufficient theory for understanding both racial exploitation and colonialism. So those are the two sort of central questions that I address in this chapter. So in terms of the first question around what I call the failures of post-apartheid democratization to deal with racism, I basically point out that what we are experiencing are the shortcomings of what I call liberal non-racialism. And I basically say that liberal non-racialism separates identity from social-economic power relations which reproduce racial hierarchies and discrimination in the first place. So in other words, liberal non-racialism doesn't pay sufficient attention to the intersecting relationship between racial identity and socio-economic power and relations in society. The second sort of point that I make around the failure of liberal non-racialism is that it ignores the complexity of apartheid and colonialism, which are macro systems of power that are comprised of various hierarchies: race, class, gender, and culture. And so the overemphasis on the moral question around racism, right, and the idea of inculcating certain values outside of locating them within systems of social reproduction produces what I call superficial conclusions about racial unity and coexistence. And so what I'm trying to say here with regards to the failures of liberal non-racialism is that it misses the importance of connecting questions of race identity to socio-economic power relations and how that is related to the persistence of racism in South Africa. And I argue that racism is not only about morals and values, which are important, but it's also about structural power. So that's how I deal with that first question. And then I come to the interesting one, which is probably the most contested, which is, has Marxism sufficiently addressed the question of both race and colonialism? In fact, Chair, I have friends who come from the Black consciousness and Pan-African tradition who still ask me why the hell am I a Marxist? So my argument in the chapter is that Marxism, like all ideologies, is not monolithic or stagnant. it has evolved, and it is contested. And if we accept that, then we have to accept that Marxism, therefore, cannot just be a monolithic, stagnant, and rigid theory that doesn't evolve over time. And what I try to point out is that this view that Marxism ignores both colonialism and racism dismisses the valuable contribution of various Marxists from the African continent and the broader global south, and also their particular activist agency. So in other words, by saying that Marxism is Eurocentric and ignores racism and ignores the colonial question, it dismisses the contributions of both African and other global south scholars to socialist thinking. And what I do there in the chapter is to rely particularly on the work of various Marxists from both the African continent and the Caribbean, who in my view have enriched socialist thinking by developing the basic premises and methods of the classical or the early tradition. And I think this is important because I don't see Marxism as just a pure ideology. I also see it as a method of analysis of the development of society. And so in some instances, people might not have come out and shouted that I'm a Marxist, but one can observe that they're using Marxist methods in the way that they historicize the development of society. And by looking at the scholarship of people like Bernard Magubane, particularly his work around the making of the racist state and the political economy of race and class, and also Cabral, and then obviously the major scholars from the Caribbean, C.L.R. James, Eric Williams, and so forth. I then use a construct in the chapter, which is a merger of both racial capitalism and what I call democratic Marxism, to basically explain the contributions of these particular Marxists to the discourse on the intersecting relationship between capitalism and race. So what were these Marxists basically saying? The first sort of point that I try to make is that what these Marxists say is that racism is embedded in the genealogy of capitalist development, in both the international and the local context. And this racism wasn't only directed to Asian, African, and other segments of the working class from the colonized world, but they also speak about intra-European racism. So for example, Magubane uses the development of the Irish working class, or the exploitation, of the Irish working class, and actually illustrates that racial identities and racial prejudice was crucial in their exploitation. I then also make the point that colonial working class exploitation was central for developing various forms of global imperial capitalism, right? And then what I do is that I show sort of that although the focus has been on just industrial capitalism, one needs to understand this by going back and looking at merchant capitalism and mercantilism as well. So in other words, this colonial working class exploitation, right, was justified using racism and racial theories. So what I try to basically say around this point about racism and the genealogy of capitalism is that racism is actually an inherent characteristic of capitalist development, not just an outcome. The second point that I try to make in this, related to these authors' contribution, is on the question of the revolutionary political subject or revolutionary political agent. What they do, what these authors do and these activists do, is to shift Marxist discourse from the classical obsession, from what I call the classical obsession with the proletariat, right? To one that recognizes the historical agency of other strata of the working class, such as the slaves and the peasants. And I think that this is very important then for reconceptualizing and rethinking around the question of the revolutionary political subject in Marxist thinking. The other point, the other sort of contribution that I highlight in the chapter is that these authors illustrate that the cultural civilization project was actually functional or integral for capitalist development. So in other words, the idea of of conquest was legitimized by the notion of civilizing the colonized working classes, right? And bringing them into this modern world, right? But this was very functional for capitalist development. And this is important because when people speak about culture, they only speak about the normative and the identitional issues related to culture, but they don't relate culture to the reproduction of particular modes of production or social formations. And I think that this is also captured in the work of Ekambaram. The other point related to the contribution of these particular authors is that they emphasize imperialism as a core element of capitalist development, right? So in other words, they don't look at capitalist relations just between, they don't look at capitalist social relations as relations just between capital and labor, but they also look at relations between capitalist and non-capitalist formations and how those intersect. And it is within this context that they pay a lot of attention to developing the theory of the underdevelopment of colonial social formations. The other point related to imperialism, and this is related to the South African discourse, is the development of the theory of the colonialism of a special type thesis. Right? Now, one of the central elements that I try to show basically in the chapter is that we might disagree with the theory of transition that characterized the CST thesis, but I think it's important because it acknowledges the centrality of race, right, in the development of racialized capitalism in South Africa. And this is not just a product of just a theoretical construct that comes from sort of descendants of European Marxists, but we also see that there are black Marxists within the Communist Party itself, such as Moses Kotane, who raised this question around understanding the historical context and specificities around the development of racialized capitalism in South Africa. And Moses Kotane pens this well in his credit letter in 1939, which basically urges the party to think about what is peculiar about South Africa, the racialized capitalism in South Africa. The last contribution, I think, by these particular scholars is that they avoid what I call a reductionist primacy debate around race and class. So they are not preoccupied with trying to figure out which one is primary, but they're trying to understand how race and class intersect and connect at different conjunctures in history. And I think this is a particularly important point because when people think about the debate between race or the debate that concerns the relationship between race and Marxism, the debate is all the centers around this primacy, which I think is not analytically useful. I think what's more analytically useful is to look at how race and class intersect in different epochs of the development of racialized capitalism. So in conclusion, I basically show through these 5 sort of points, right, that Marxism has, or Marxist scholars and Marxism has actually in fact addressed racism adequately. And that Marxism is also not overly Eurocentric and does not only focus on economic reductionism. I also then point out at the end that Marxism has also provided a solid theory for also understanding the relationship between racialized capitalism and imperialism, right? And that in South Africa we should appreciate the complexity and evolution of the racialized capitalist system over different epochs. And then in the end, I also then say that this discourse around radical economic transformation, white monopoly capital and so forth, sort of illustrates what I say earlier on about the preoccupation with identity without relating it to social relations of production, and also then being stuck with the purest sort of cultural debate around the question of race. Thanks.
Good evening. So I'm going to use this 15 minutes to explain the essence of the chapter is really to just document the fact that as South Africans, as a South African state, we are xenophobic to foreign nationals. But I will have a disclaimer on foreign nationals. And we're not only, and the disclaimer will explain that it's not just xenophobic, but it has a very disturbing racist element to it, and broadly in the context of class. So the foreign nationals that I'm speaking about are not of the Gupta class and brand. They're not the foreign nationals who have skills. They are not the foreign nationals who own property. It's the most vulnerable, the disadvantaged Black African foreign nationals, predominantly coming from the African continent. And the chapter speaks to locating this phenomenon of movement and migration in a context of apartheid, of migrant labor, extreme exploitation of Black migrant labor, and how our policies, or the implementation of our policies, fails to take into account that context towards the important goal of transformation and our struggle for equality. Now, yesterday marked, the 10th of April marked 26 years since Comrade Chris Hani was assassinated. And a few months, or maybe even less, in an interview with a brilliant historian, Louis Telemikos, he spoke about why he joined the African National Congress. And in it, it explains very clearly and explicitly how migrant labor, the impact that it had on communities in South Africa under the racially segregated racist laws. And he says that he belonged to, I'll quote him directly, "I belonged to a world in terms of my background which suffered, I think, the worst extremes of apartheid. A poor rural area where the majority of working people spent their times in the compounds and hostels away from families." So this, when we speak about migration and movement, we don't think about how the geopolitics of our country was framed by this form of exploitation and extraction from the majority of people in our country, but in our region as well. You know, a democratic, and now I want to speak to why I use the word non-white. Democratic Marxism would never have reached the fourth publication if it was produced 26 years ago. The publication and Vish would probably have been banned and kept in detention without trial, and with very little option to have legal recourse as a Black person. So the word is meant to make a profound impact on us in understanding the manner in which we are treating foreign nationals seeking protection in our country, the most vulnerable. And for me, it represents an era when being a Black person in white South Africa made you illegal and made you unwanted. And today, many people, predominantly from the African continent, find themselves in exactly the same position in South Africa, in a democratic dispensation with a constitution that is lauded as one of the most progressive in the world. And they are referred to as illegal, they are undocumented, stripped of all their rights intrinsic to their very being. And human dignity and human rights of our fellow African brothers and sisters is trampled upon not only by South Africans, but by law enforcement agents, the Department of Home Affairs, Department of Education, Department of Health, provincial governments, and as we speak right now, the scapegoating is at its highest as we move towards elections. We are seeing the emergence of incredibly reactionary parties, the African Basic Movement, reactionary racist parties, not only against foreign nationals, but fueling racism in communities as well. And I think that my emotive contribution today is because I think there's a serious lacking in our response as people who are committed to equality, who fought against racism, who fought against inequality, fought against injustice. And in our name, this is continuing. And I think that that's a major blight on us as people committed to the struggle for equality in society. We see, as the Lawyers for Human Rights, we run these walk-in clinics, and what's overwhelming is the fact that the police remain a law unto themselves, unreconstructed, exactly functioning as the apartheid police did. And I shiver every time I have to confront it, because it brings back the trauma of living under the apartheid regime. And the danger, that is the very danger. We've seen the excessive use of force against the Peace Must Fall movement. We've seen it in Marikana, and it's exactly the same that's being meted out on a daily basis to the most vulnerable foreign nationals seeking refuge in our country. And as I said, this is predominantly against black vulnerable migrants who are entering our country. The chapter speaks about the changes in policy and the proposed changes in policy. Our refugee bill is incredibly progressive as it stands. It talks about urban integration. It's framed on respect for human rights, respect for human dignity. The Bill of Rights is about the rights for all people living in South Africa, the protection of human dignity, and that comes directly from our past and what we experienced under the apartheid regime, but it's not worth the paper it's written on. So I think speaking about the policies, it makes you understand the very conscious move that that's a Freudian slip, the current state and its strategy around how to manage movement. And I think that this is a challenge, an international global challenge that we're faced with. In this context, we must critically engage with the current policy changes being proposed by the relevant authorities and that led to the Department of Home Affairs. Policies that will result, and I think these are the dangers that we don't see enough outcry about. We're going to see the confinement of so-called asylum seekers in processing centers and a massive effort by the military and police to force and keep people from entering into our country. How long people are going to stay in these processing centers is not known. And what conditions they're going to live under is not known. So I think that just very briefly, in terms of the global context, we need to understand the significance of the September 11, what took place in 2001. And in that incident, when Bush declared that you're either with us or you're against us, we saw in that a marked setback against human rights and human dignity. And since then, we've seen an increased progression in the name of counter-terrorism. We're witnessing, to this day, appalling violations being committed of human rights, all in the name of the fight against terrorism. And this othering is what is the kind of climate which emboldens our government to carry out these policies and in the name of security, national security. And we have to interrogate this, in whose interest is this protection of national security? Certainly not against the poor and the most vulnerable. I think that the other thing that we need to interrogate in this context with respect to refugees and people fleeing, and this doesn't even begin to talk about climate change and people being forced to move. If we're looking at protection very narrowly in terms of I'm fleeing because my life is at risk, there was a very common phrase which we used to use during the days of apartheid, where it was one person's freedom fighter was another person's terrorist. And in that era, the imperialist America supported a particular side in the Cold War, and of course the Chinese and Russians had their refugees that they would support, so the ANC in exile was supported. Today, refugees have no value. So it's this that's also fueling the fact that there's surplus, just like structural unemployed people, migrants, people on the move are surplus and are stripped of any respect for human rights and human dignity. So in conclusion, I think that we need to locate this in the broader global context of the multinational corporates. We find that the movement of capital, that's goods, factories, industries, It's possible, it's protected by trade treaties. Wars are fought over trade routes and access to land, oil, minerals. We're seeing a second colonization of the African continent, whether it's land, whether it's what's happening in the DRC, and yet respecting human rights and human dignity and the very basic human rights of every human born is not, it's not the same as the value that we give to what capitalism gives value to. And of course, the casualty is always in reducing costs, it's human beings, and in this context, it's black African human beings once again. So the testimonies detailing the manner in which poor, vulnerable black Africans are treated as they struggle to gain access to legal documentation in South Africa reminds me of how I, and fellow black people living in South Africa, were treated, living under the most repressive apartheid state and classified as non-white. Thank you.
Okay, so my offering is titled 7 Theses on Radical Non-Racialism, the Climate Crisis, and Deep Just Transitions, from the national question to the ecocide question. So this chapter is framed around these theses, which I'll just walk you through and maybe highlight some of the arguments they anchored in. But the starting point is to kind of enter the fray, because the principle of non-racialism is being disparaged, it's being jettisoned, it's being caricatured, and it's being portrayed sometimes in a very facile way. So it's kind of entering that fight. But the other point to make by way of introduction is that this is not a defense of official non-racialism, particularly the non-racialism of the ruling party. This is a defense of radical non-racialism, and a non-racialism that has its roots in the history of people's struggle. And the third point to make is that the chapter attempts to really resituate this principle of non-racialism in the context of the struggle that we are facing of a heating world, the challenge of our species extinction, climate ecocide. So basically the chapter is arguing that the national question framework of the national liberation movement is discredited, it is outdated, it is ill-equipped for us to deal with this fundamental existential challenge. And that the more fundamental question to define politics today is the ecocide question. So thesis 1 very simply is, radical non-racialism is central to a people's history of struggle and achieved a hegemonic location in the national liberation struggle against apartheid. Its challenge to racialized exploitation, white supremacy, gender oppression, and oppressions in general, because of its deep humanist impulse, defined its radicalism. So, I mean, if you look at the Freedom Charter, the Freedom Charter opens with these beautiful words: South Africa belongs to all who live in it, black and white. And when this was adopted in the mid-50s, this was a defining milestone, a programmatic signal, a turning point for national liberation politics. But it also entrenched the centrality of the principle of non-racialism. Now, the Freedom Charter does not, despite the mythic histories of the ANC that it puts out and so on, does not belong to the ANC. Actually, the legitimacy of that document, of that statement, and there's a great book that Jeremy and another comrade Satgar wrote on the Freedom Charter. The Freedom Charter came from below. It was an expression of people's aspirations about a society beyond apartheid. Its legitimacy, its political purchase, its power came from the weight that the masses of our people put behind that document and its articulation. So not the Indian Congress, not the ANC, not the Colored People's Congress, or any of the other Congress could claim this document as theirs. This is a very important point, and there's other arguments related to this. But the other point around this is that non-racial politics also gave us a sense of strategic solidarity. It enabled us to build solidarity within our communities. So you had these abnormal communities where you lived in my case, all Indian people and so on. But you were able to build solidarities there, but you were also able to build solidarities beyond with other groups in our country. So strategic solidarity was very central to the politics of non-racialism. The other very important thrust around it was the marriage of a critique with capitalism. Despite, again, all the moves made by the national liberation movement, etc., that it's not capitalist and not socialist, etc., actually, if you read the Freedom Charter, it is an anti-capitalist perspective. If you were to implement it today, it will go against the logic of capitalist accumulation. Okay? And that's another very important defining aspect, if you like, of radical non-racialism. The third aspect to it is that it was definitely anti-white supremacy. And so it wasn't anti-white, but anti a supremacist ideology and project that was attempting to define our social and political order. The fourth point about radical non-racialism is that it really was also about an existential challenge to ourselves. Because we were born in a racist society, we are meant to be socially engineered as racists, all of us, black and white. But it really was about us confronting that. And so if you look at the biographies of various leaders from our movement, particularly the non-racial tradition, Ahmad Kathrada being one of them, they were telling that story. Madiba in his book, On the Long Walk to Freedom, is also telling that story of how they had to confront their own racisms as well, and become who they became. And that's very, very important. So we don't start from the premise that we are all just perfect anti-racist beings. We start from the premise that we are born in a racist society, we were marked by that, and we have to confront that in the radical non-racial tradition. Thesis 2, very quickly, radical non-racialism shares important common ground with black consciousness, but also goes beyond it in significant ways to achieve a future South Africa beyond skin color. So in this conjuncture that we are in, we are seeing a resurgence of, if you like, different currents of black consciousness. Academic black consciousness is very interesting, at least at this university, and in terms of some of the articulations around it. And one of the views around academic black consciousness, Dimitri Erasmus's perspective, is that it's a philosophy of love. And what I'm arguing in this book is that there's common ground between those versions of black consciousness and radical non-racialism, because radical non-racialism is deeply a humanist project at its core. And that kind of common ground needs to be built. But at the same time, though, radical non-racialism stands, if you like, in opposition to a nativist nationalism, like articulated through the EFF, for example. Because this is a version or a current in this typology of black consciousness that actually stands against the four characteristics of radical non-racialism that I've been talking about. Its dialectic is basically the African population versus the rest in our country. Thesis 3, very quickly, is that radical non-racialism was defeated in the transition to democracy and was displaced by rainbowism, an Afro-neoliberal approach to nation building, and the authoritarian corruption of the Zuma regime. Radical non-racialism is not the same as rainbowism, liberal democracy, or narrow black nationalism. So here, I mean, if you look at the journey and the itinerary of non-racialism, particularly with the ANC in power and so on, it mutates. It goes through a rainbowism and a very shallow rainbowism. It goes through the African Renaissance, which was also a version of Afro-neoliberalism, and it becomes resource nationalism, particularly under Zuma's radical economic transformation. But then again, this version of non-racialism is tied to a very corrupt politics, and a politics that has lost its hegemonic position in our society and that is in crisis. Thesis 4, very quickly, is that the ANC embrace of deep globalization, the unraveling of its hegemonic project, and its populist call for radical economic transformation has unleashed new conjunctural racisms in South Africa, undermining the future of the country. Now, in this regard, Sharon has already covered xenophobia, for instance. The way the land question is being used in South Africa, it has to be addressed. There is historical injustice, but it pits two kinds of chauvinistic nationalisms, two binaries come to the fore in our politics today. On the one hand, nativist African nationalism, and on the other hand, a residual Afrikaner nationalism, and so on. So you have, in the context of the crisis of the unraveling of official non-racialism and the national liberation project, these re-racializing dynamics emerging in our society. Thesis 5, very quickly, is that the climate crisis threatens the existence of humans and non-human life forms. Eco-imperialism and capital as a geological force are driving the climate crisis in the context of the Anthropocene. So the Marxism of national liberation politics has an ontological weakness, and that is why it cannot confront this challenge. It has not taken nature seriously. So if you look at the national question approach, it's been anchored in a political economy and an understanding of historical capitalism that is completely blind to ecological relations. Okay? So in other words, to confront the climate crisis today, we really have to break new ground. And we have to leave behind a conception of the national question that's tied to a productivist, patriarchal conception of, if you like, modernizing capitalist society. Thesis 6 is that the ANC-led alliance approach and more generally the orthodox Marxist approaches to the national question are outdated in the context of the dangerous climate contradiction and the deepening planetary ecological crisis. The national question has to be replaced by the ecocide question. So basically here this thesis summarizes the argument and attempts to, well, no, not this one. This one basically attempts to make that transition out of, if you like, the national question framework and highlights that the national question, besides having this limit around ecological relations, it also is the preserve of vanguards. It's the preserve of the ANC and it's the preserve of the Communist Party. And both of these vanguards literally are in a state of degeneration right now. And so the national question framework in the South African context is tied to a reproduction of the minerals energy complex, it's tied to reproducing the climate crisis, and it's tied to a politics that is really locked into this trajectory. And then thesis 7 basically is that securing a future and overcoming the ecocidal logic of capitalism lies in a democratic eco-socialist nation-building project. Such a project has to confront the climate crisis through deep, just transitions, grounded in radical non-racialism, mass transformative politics, and the reclamation of our sovereignty to sustain life. So this doesn't mean that we mustn't take historical racism seriously, that we must not take conjunctural racism seriously, but if we are going to confront the climate crisis, we have to, if you like, foreground those dimensions of our social reality, but we also, because it's going to impact, if you like, the majority of the historically oppressed the hardest, but we also have to take the science very seriously and place that front and center. We also, if you like, have to ensure that we renew mass people's power. And this is where the principle of radical non-racialism becomes important. Its strategic politics, its commitment to anti-white supremacy, its marriage to a critique of capitalism, and its existential commitment to bringing out the best of who we are as human beings. And ultimately, the chapter ends with arguing that if we want to end the war with nature, then, of course, radical non-racialism, together with advancing a project of democratic eco-socialism, is central to our times. Thank you.
Good evening, everybody. You know, when I came to Wits in 1980, so I arrived here, and there's this thing called the Black Student Society. And all they're talking about is Das Kapital, Volume 1, Volume 2, Volume 3. And I have no clue what they're talking about. But you know that if you don't have this book with you, you're not going to fit in. So I go to De Jong's, which was the bookshop at the time, and I buy Volume 1, 2, and 3. I start with Volume 1, page 1, page 1, page 1. And eventually I put it away. To my regret, had I done that, had I not done that, I perhaps would have understood some of the stuff here a bit better. Because I'm intrigued with the variety of Marxisms that are out there. I mean, for me, I think that was a huge learning from this. I never grasped the kind of Eurocentric, non-Eurocentric nature of Marxism. Up until I started grappling with this in the last few days, only to then find that you've now introduced democratic Marxism, which I would have assumed is an inherent quality of Marxism. But nevertheless, after having come from Berlin in the last few days, and having seen there and listened to people who lived on the eastern side, their own experiences with that form of Marxism raised a lot of questions about its democratic character itself. So I can understand why there's a need to insert the democratic nature into this. So I really appreciated that. I think the second thing for me was this Christian doctrine of discovery from 1492, which lays the basis then for slavery and colonialism. Again, was something in all of my history work, I have not picked up that specific detail, because I have been trying to understand, after reading Ibrahim Tandi's book on the roots of racism in the US and so forth, what gave rise to this? What made people from Aristotle and other key philosophers of the time to actually be racist at the time, and to promote this in a very huge way. And I've been surprised, from Voltaire to Rousseau and all of them, the kind of racism that permeates their own thinking. And that's the kind, and what I was hoping that we would actually get to do at some point is a similar kinds of project to understand the evolution of racism in South Africa from way back when. There's bits and pieces all over, but you won't find this in a compendium. So I think that racism after apartheid, the theoretical stuff here, I think is also of huge value. My work, however, is slightly more on the practical side. And trying to understand what has given continued life and energy and oxygen to racism in South Africa. I'm not sure I'm in full agreement that it's a natural hangover from in your view, a failed negotiated transition. I, however, think that it's a series of things. One, it's a structural nature within the economy, but I think it's a weak response to actually understand what was required to combat it and to work towards its eradication beyond at the formal level. So I think the first 5 years, lots of legislation, lots of policy work gets done, and then we stop. We actually stop doing the kind of building of anti-racism, analytical skills, capacity. As we sit here, South Africa today, probably has 4 or 5 dedicated organizations developed to tackling and dealing with racism in this country. So, assuming you even want to do the basics around education and training and awareness, you will not find that capacity, and never mind dedicated policy work. Although I think with the creation of the Center for Diversity Studies here and in a number of other places, it's still not sufficient. And when I look at what's happening across the world, it's just been a flourishing of this kind of capacity, which then feeds into movements. I was at Yale 3 weeks ago and listening to some of the people from Black Lives Matter and those who are also doing anti-racism work amongst American Jews, young Jewish people. A lot of that comes from having gone through this intensive anti-racism training. But not just at a conceptual level, it's translating that into organizational ability to then build movements to tackle these things. And that's just a huge capacity gap in South Africa. But political will, to illustrate the weaknesses of political will, we host the World Conference Against Racism in 2001. A minimal outcome of that conference was that every country who signed up to the declaration would produce a national action plan to combat racism. South African cabinet has only adopted its draft or its national action plan this year. And even that, it is perhaps of the weakest quality in terms of what actually needs to be done. There's a lot of stuff around understanding the problem, but in terms of what needs to be done, it is incredibly weak. It took a lot of persuasion and pressure to get it there, but it's still far from complete. When you compare it to some of the others in the world, this is way behind. And when I got to understand why, there are two people in the Department of Justice who have had to work on this thing on an ad hoc basis for the last 15 years. Now, that's the political world. And why I'm saying that, you see, sometimes when we just draw it down to in some ways, the documents here do reduce it to just economic issues. I think sometimes it's just a failure of political will and political organization. Sharon, the issue I'm grappling with, this country is xenophobic across race and class. All research will show that. I was at a public meeting last night, and I couldn't believe young ANC activists. This was an election meeting. I went just to go and understand what is happening so that I could figure out what I need to do or not do on the 8th. And all of these young people who were talking were saying, essentially, we want these foreigners out. They're taking on jobs. They're taking all kinds of opportunities. And these were young professionals. And basically they see foreigners in a particular way as taking away their stuff. We don't have a response other than to say that it's wrong. And saying that it's wrong is not going to prevent the kind of right-wing shifts you've seen across the world where poor working class people will support right-wing parties and put them into power. So appealing just to the rationality on this issue is not going to work either. I'm not sure what the issues are, whether it's open borders, closed borders, what the issues are, and what kind of organizing will actually bridge these gaps. I think we need to move beyond just appealing to, or rather making this an issue of right and wrong. It is not going to swing it. You've seen places like Sweden and others who did not in their wildest dreams think that there would be a right-wing shift. Today, right-wing movements have grown in leaps and bounds primarily on this issue there. And I think as progressives, we can pontificate about how wrong this is. But unless we begin to develop a grassroots response that organizes around the issues that makes this understanding attractive to people, we are going to, 10 years from now, you will see this, what is this party called? It's the African Basic Movement will be in the upper ranks of supporting parties in this country. There's a couple of other things, but there is this outstanding issue that we also tend not to take too seriously. I've been grappling with it. The continued usage of racial classification, what that does and doesn't do for a non-racial project. And sometimes I'm flippant about it. My own response is, I don't care what you want to call me, so long as you don't treat me in an unequal way, because then I'll get angry. As much as I try not to define myself as Indian, other parties want to do that and want to put me on a boat, so that's fine. But it's whether or not the usage of racial classifications and categorization enables racist thinking, or whether it's an area of work that we consciously need to do more work. And Dimitri and others have done that kind of work. I think it needs to be brought back into the fore. In the US today, you can take part in a census and you can refuse to classify yourself according to whatever category. There are other ways in which we can measure whether people, the levels of deprivation, whether we're increasing or decreasing. And I think we need to find that. Because to conclude, work that we've done in the Kasara Foundation, just looking at the allocation of housing to poor people in the south of Johannesburg, was huge revelations. City of Joburg under the ANC. Officials would only take one thing into account, and that is race, in allocating houses to the poor. And not taking into account whether or not what the actual levels of poverty and deprivation were. And they would simply dismiss Indian, colored, white applicants who were perhaps poorer than some of the African applicants there, purely on the basis of race. They changed when it came slightly closer to local government elections. And then they allocated small quotas of homes because they thought it would win them votes in the forthcoming election. And that's when these kinds of things get manipulated for the worst possible purposes. So I think there's a lot more to unpack about how racism has in fact changed and hasn't changed in post-apartheid South Africa, and what responses it requires from us, which are continuities of the old, but also what is it that's new that will be required from us.
Thanks to all of you. I should have also said at the very beginning, one of the principles of this book series is that it crosses the activist-scholarly divide, so there's always a strong emphasis for practitioners who've spent their lives, like Sharon and Sean, that contribute to discussants to engage on these issues. Okay, open to discussion, comments, points we have.